She was just 19 years old when she met a teenage butcher working in a small shop in rural Sinaloa. She came from a family with connections to the local drug trade. He came from poverty and ambition. They ran away together, married in secret, and built a love story that would span over 5 decades. But this wasn't an ordinary romance. It was the foundation of a criminal empire worth billions. Her name is Rosario Cardoza, known as Chayito, while her husband, Ismael El Mayo Zambada, became the world's most elusive drug lord. She remained even more invisible, the ghost queen behind a $3 billion empire. No interviews, no photographs beyond grainy ID images, no social media presence, just a network of dairy farms, gas stations, and construction companies that laundered millions while she raised a family in the mountains of Sinaloa. For over 50 years, she was married to a man who never saw the inside of a prison cell, until July 25th, 2024, when everything changed. Today, we step inside the hidden life of Rosario Cardoza, the woman who helped create a kingpin and became the invisible billionaire of the cartel world. This is her story. October 6, 1946. El Dorado, a small town within Culiacan, Sinaloa, Mexico. Rosario Cardoza was born into a world where the line between legitimate farming and drug cultivation had blurred generations before she took her first breath. Her family wasn't desperately poor. They had connections, relatives in the business, the polite way people in Sinaloa referred to drug trafficking, in a region where opportunities for legitimate wealth were scarce. Having family members who could navigate the drug trade meant access to money, protection, and opportunities that other families didn't have. This was her normal. Growing up in 1950s Sinaloa, she understood the economy that ran her region. The farmers in the mountains who grew more than just corn. The cash that flowed despite few legitimate industries. She didn't need anyone to explain how Sinaloa worked. She lived it every day. And it's why when she met an ambitious young man working in a butcher shop, she recognized something in him that other girls might have missed: the butcher's shop romance. As teenagers in the early 1960s, both Rosario and Ismael Zambada Garcia frequented a butcher shop in their area of Sinaloa. He worked there, not as the owner, but as a young employee trying to make honest money. She would come regularly, and that's where their paths crossed. She was around 19, he was about 17. The chemistry was immediate and intense, but there was a complication: Rosario's family. Despite their own connections to the drug trade, they weren't eager to see their daughter involved with a poor butcher's assistant. So Ismael and Rosario made a decision that would define both their lives. They ran away together. According to family accounts documented by Mexican journalist Anabel Hernandez, El Mayo se la robó. He essentially swept her away. In rural Mexican culture of that era, this phrase described elopement, when a young couple ran off together against family wishes. They didn't just run away, they got married twice. First, a church wedding in Costa Rica, Sinaloa, giving their union religious legitimacy. Then, a civil marriage in El Dorado, making it legally official. Rosario Cardoza, at 19 years old, became Rosario de Zambada, and her teenage husband would soon outgrow his butcher shop ambitions. But Rosario wasn't just a wife, she was a connector. According to accounts in El Traidor, Rosario's family connections became Ismael's entry point into the drug trade. One of her brothers-in-law was already involved in trafficking. He saw something in young Ismael, maybe his ambition, his intelligence, or simply that he was family now. He brought Ismael into his first drug harvest, likely marijuana or opium cultivation in the mountains. For Rosario, this was a pivotal moment. Her husband was leaving legitimate work to enter the family business, the one everyone knew was dangerous but offered opportunities a butcher shop never would. She stayed through everything that came next. She stayed over the next decades as Ismael built his reputation in the drug trade. Rosario built a family. The children came steadily. Vicente Zambada Niebla, El Vicentillo, who became his father's right-hand man before being arrested and extradited to the U.S. Maria Teresa, Miriam Patricia, Monica del Rosario, and Modesta Zambada Niebla 4 daughters who would later be sanctioned by U.S. authorities for their roles in money laundering. 5 children who grew up knowing their father was becoming one of the most powerful criminals in Mexico, and their mother was the constant presence holding the family together. El Mayo had other women and additional children, but Rosario remained the first wife, the primary partner, the matriarch. She was the foundation upon which he built his empire. By the 1990s, El Mayo had become co-leader of the Sinaloa cartel, and Rosario's role evolved from housewife to something far more sophisticated, the manager of his financial empire. She wasn't just spending cartel money, she was laundering it through an intricate network of businesses that would take U.S. law enforcement decades to fully understand. The crown jewel was Lecheria Santa Monica, a large-scale dairy and cattle operation. This wasn't a small farm. This was an industrial operation, processing milk, raising cattle, employing hundreds, and generating substantial revenue. On paper, it was legitimate. In reality, according to U.S. Treasury investigations, it was a sophisticated money laundering operation, converting drug profits into agricultural income. But the dairy was just the beginning. The empire, attributed to Rosario and her daughters, included Gasolinera Rosario, a gas station where fuel sales laundered cash. Establo, Puerto Rico, ranching operations in Sinaloa's rural areas. Llamaro Construcciones, a construction company perfect for inflating costs. Multiservicios, JVs, transportation services. Estancia Infantil, Niño Feliz, a child care center, brilliant for cash-based money laundering. The sophistication cannot be overstated. This was a diversified business portfolio spanning agriculture, energy, construction, transportation, and child care. Sectors chosen because they deal in high cash volumes. The U.S. strikes back. For years, this network operated quietly, but eventually the U.S. Treasury and DEA connected the dots. They identified Rosario not as a passive housewife, but as central to the Sinaloa cartel's financial infrastructure. The hammer fell in the 2000s. The U.S. Treasury designated Rosario and 4 of her daughters as key members of the Zambada money laundering network. The sanctions meant any U.S. assets frozen. Americans couldn't do business with them, travel restricted, access to international banking severed. The U.S. government was sending a message: we see you, we know what you're doing, and we're cutting you off. Life in the mountains. So what was Rosario's actual life like? Unlike younger narco wives who post on Instagram, Rosario remained invisible. In 2010, El Mayo gave a rare interview to journalist Julio Scherer Garcia. He revealed, "I have my wife, 5 women, 15 grandchildren, and a great-grandchild. They are all here in the ranches, daughters of the mountains like me." This tells us everything. Rosario lived on ranches in rural Sinaloa, Durango, or Chihuahua. Not in mansions or penthouses, in the Sierra, protected by terrain and her husband's organization. She shared this space with El Mayo's other women and extended family. Multiple generations living in the compound-style arrangements, protected and isolated, based on the businesses she controlled. We can picture her life. Well-appointed ranch houses, comfortable but not ostentatious, security but not military style, the kind of place where a wealthy rancher might live, not a cartel queen. Her days involved managing legitimate businesses, the dairy operations, the gas station, construction projects. These required real oversight to maintain their legitimacy as fronts. She had access to millions, but she didn't display it. No designer shopping sprees, no plastic surgery, no luxury cars on social media. Why? Because invisibility was survival. The more visible you are, the easier to track. Rosario understood what younger cartel family members don't. Silence is the ultimate luxury. Rosario's most important role was as a mother, and she watched her children follow their father into the cartel life. Vicente became El Vicentilo, his father's heir apparent. Brilliant, educated, deeply involved in operations. Eventually arrested, extradited, and sentenced to 15 years in a U.S. prison. Her daughters took different paths, managing businesses, laundering money, creating the legitimate facade, protecting family wealth. Eventually, they too faced U.S. sanctions. Rosario raised her children knowing their father was one of the world's most wanted criminals. She raised them with wealth built on blood and drugs. She raised them to be loyal to family above all else. And she watched as, one by one, they faced the consequences. By the 2020s, Rosario's world was changing. El Chapo, her husband's partner, was serving life in a Colorado prison. The Sinaloa cartel faced unprecedented pressure. Internal tensions grew, violence increased, and El Mayo was aging, in his 70s, suffering from diabetes, limited mobility. The question of succession became urgent. For Rosario, these changes must have been terrifying. She'd spent over 50 years building this life. Her son was in U.S. prison. Her daughters were sanctioned. Her husband was the last dinosaur from a dying era. U.S. documents from this period describe Rosario as El Mayos' former spouse rather than wife. Were they legally divorced for asset protection? Was this how authorities categorized a relationship with multiple partners? Did they actually separate? We don't know. What we know is that throughout the 2010s and 2020s, Rosario remained connected to the financial empire, continued to be sanctioned, and presumably remained in contact with the man she'd married over 50 years earlier. July 25th, 2024. Everything changes. Then came the call. Rosario must have dreaded for decades. On July 25th, 2024, Ismael El Mayo Zambada Garcia was captured, allegedly lured to a meeting in northern Mexico by El Chapo's son, then kidnapped and flown across the border where U.S. federal agents waited. After 50 years of evading capture, the ghost was caught. For Rosario, this moment must have been devastating, but not surprising. She'd watched other bosses fall, watched her son get extradited, seen El Chapo imprisoned for life. She knew this day would come. The only question was when. So where is Rosario Cardoza now? How does she live? The truth is, we don't know for certain. The woman who spent 5 decades avoiding cameras didn't suddenly become visible after her husband's arrest. What we can infer, she's still in Mexico, almost certainly in Sinaloa. At 78 years old, she's not fleeing or starting over. The mountains are her home. She still has significant wealth. Despite sanctions, the businesses still exist, and money hidden in Mexico remains beyond U.S. reach. She's surrounded by family, her daughters, grandchildren, the extended Zambada clan protecting their matriarch. She's probably relieved in some ways. For 50 years, she lived with fear her husband would be killed or captured. Now he's in custody but alive. She can communicate with him, but she's grieving. The man she's loved since 19 will spend his remaining years in a U.S. prison. At their ages, he's 76, she's 78. This is essentially goodbye. What happens to Rosario's businesses? The dairy, gas stations, construction companies. U.S. sanctions remain, but in Mexico, where the Zambada name carries weight and corruption allows cartel businesses to operate, these enterprises continue. The dairy still produces milk. The gas station still sells fuel. The construction company still builds. Money, now from other sources, still flows. This was always Rosario's genius. She created financial infrastructure that could survive even if the kingpin fell. These businesses have their own legitimacy now, independent of the cartel. Build something that lasts beyond the drug trade, create generational wealth, ensure the family's financial security, even if the patriarch goes to prison. Rosario succeeded. Whatever happens, the Zambada family will not be poor. Rosario Cardoza lived a life most can't imagine. She met a teenage butcher and recognized ambition that would build billions. She married him in secret and stood beside him for 50 years, while he became one of history's most wanted criminals. She raised a family in Sinaloa's mountains, knowing her children would inherit both wealth and danger. And she built a financial network so sophisticated that U.S. law enforcement needed decades to unravel it. But what's her legacy? She wasn't innocent. The businesses laundered millions from an organization that flooded America with drugs, caused countless overdose deaths, fueled violence across Mexico. Her comfortable life was built on suffering. But she also wasn't the trafficker. She didn't order murders or negotiate drug deals. She was a wife who supported her husband, a mother who protected her children, a businesswoman who managed enterprises, even if those enterprises served illegitimate purposes. The truth is complicated. Rosario made choices within the constraints of where she was born, who she loved, and what options were available. She could have left at various points, but chose to stay. She could have refused to participate, but chose to build the empire. These were her choices. Now at 78, she lives with the consequences. What's remarkable in an era of social media where everyone seeks attention, where narco wives flaunt their luxuries online, Rosario maintained absolute silence for over 50 years. No interviews, no social media, no public statements. Just the ghost queen, managing her empire from shadows, raising her family in mountains, building businesses that would outlast the drug trade. She was the woman behind the ghost, the invisible partner of the invisible kingpin. While the world obsessed over El Chapo's escapes and El Mayos' elusiveness, Rosario quietly built the financial foundation that made everything possible. Now El Mayo faces life in a U.S. prison. The empire is fracturing. The Sinaloa cartel continues under new leadership, but the era of old-school traffickers is over. And Rosario, she remains what she's always been. Invisible, protected, surviving. The ghost queen of a fallen empire, living out her final years in the mountains where her story began, over 70 years ago. This was the life of Rosario Cardoza, the teenage girl who fell in love with a butcher, the young bride who ran away to marry him, the mother who raised a criminal dynasty, and the businesswoman who built $1 billion empire in the shadows. She was never the kingpin, but she was always the queen. If you want to see more stories about the hidden figures behind the world's most powerful cartels, the wives, the mothers, the sisters who build empires from the shadows, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. These are the stories that never get told. The women who remain invisible while shaping history.